Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon. I'm the Dean of Graduate Research at Flinders University, and welcome to Vlog 217. Shame. Yes, this is the next instalment in our comma series, and as always we'll go through a series of systems and structures for you today. We'll put in place some definitions of shame, then we'll move into how shame operates in universities, and we finish off with a much more buoyant, optimistic ending about how you can manage shame. And I've loved doing the research on this one. This has been very, very confronting, great research. I've discovered a remarkable field that I didn't even know existed, shame studies. Who knew that was a thing? I know it was a thing, shame studies, it's fantastic. And I really would recommend to you one of the finest books I've ever read, actually, and it's on the history of shame by Peter Stearns. Peter Stearns, remarkable work. And shame studies, we talk a lot about interdisciplinarity and antidisciplinarity and post-disciplinarity, but shame studies really is the full deal. It activates and utilises folkloric studies, philosophy, psychology, sociology, but also anthropology and philosophy, and works in a very interesting way when we come to think about ethnography. So wow, this has been fascinating. Can I also say there's been a great sub-area of history that I've enjoyed and read about for about 20 years. I'm sure it had a much longer history, but I've been aware of it for 20 years. That's called the history of emotions. And those of you that are interested in these sub-areas, the history of emotions is a really evocative and powerful area of history and historiography. And of course, shame studies also works there as well. Shame, this is different, this one, because shame is the most hidden in our comma series, and that's why it can remain, and often does remain, a full stop, because shame lives in the dark. It lives in isolation, being alone in the full meaning of aloneness. And shame also is masked by other emotional states. And I know it does seem, for most of us, commonsensically, that shame, blame, guilt and embarrassment sort of overlap a bit. But Ruth Benedict argued that shame is actually different from guilt, and I was heavily convinced by this argument. So shame emerges when there's a violation of cultural or social values and norms, whereas guilt emerges through a violation of personal or internal norms, okay? So guilt, internal, shame, external. So when we survey our greatest fears, invariably pick a country when there's what's your greatest fear, you'd think death would be it, but no, death is not our greatest fear. What is it? Public speaking. So of course the fear is not the speaking, the fear is not public speaking, the fear is actually being ashamed in public. So the speaking bit's not the issue. Speaking in public and being ashamed in public, that's the fear. And I often think about the word that we use to describe public speaking. It was mortifying. Mortifying. Mort, death. So shame is not about our weaknesses, right? We all have plenty of weaknesses, tons. Shame emerges when we become self-conscious because those weaknesses have been expressed in public. So, examples, there's a lot of them. Think about corporal punishment. How could that even exist? Why would it exist? And of course, what corporal punishment is the public exposure and acknowledgement of our weaknesses. It reveals physical responses to shame, blushing, looking down, insular. You see people that are ashamed, that notion that they turn inward, and the desire to hide or to escape. And it tumbles pretty quickly into helplessness, into incompetence, inferiority, and this is going to be important for us, powerlessness. Okay, so shame is tethered to humiliation. So recognize here that shame is not an individual feeling. It's a feeling that emerges when our weaknesses are aired in public. Now, we all know the language, the sentences, the phrases that trigger shame. And of course, it happens to all of us, and of course, and this is important again, these phrases cascade from people that we admire, okay? So your parents, teachers, supervisors. I'm disappointed in you. You can do better than this. Is this the best that you can do? You'll never amount to anything. You're such a loser. You're never going to get a job. Now, when people say this, think parents, think teachers, think supervisors, then what happens is they might only say it once, but it replays endlessly in our head in a loop. And we all know the, if you will, enabling behaviours of shame. So name-calling, raging, criticising, blaming, but also threatening behaviours, which I think are almost worse. Belittling is a word we don't talk about a lot. Belittling. Teasing, manipulation, withholding, sarcasm is a big one. And also an interruption of our thoughts and ideas. You know those people that whenever we try and say a sentence before we've got to word 3, they come in? Shame. So what's going on here? Well, let's think about shame in popular culture, and there are a lot of examples. So for example, Cersei in Game of Thrones is a great example. Do you remember the Walk of Shame? Shame. Shame. Those of you that can't remember it, it was the nudie bit. Well, one of the nudie bits of Game of Thrones. Shame. Shame, she was nude and the weird hair and stuff. So, Walk of Shame. But also The Handmaid's Tale, of which the whole point is, I think, shame. And of course, famously, The Scarlet Letter in its fantastic original novel, but also the subsequent telemovies and also films. So I've chosen these examples intentionally because we are not born in shame. Shame exists in the space between the individual and the group, the individual and society. And that's the key. Here we go. Shame is the mechanism through which individuals are taught the normalities of a social group. So shame builds and maintains social hierarchies. Now, of course, Freud dismissed shame as a feminine attribute, bless, and as always, Freud, bless him, wrong, but as always with Freud, productively wrong, and he taught us something, perhaps what not he was trying to teach us, but actually he taught us an important lesson, because he led us to a truth by describing it as a feminine attribute or characteristic. Because as Stearns has shown us, socially dominant groups experience guilt. Shame is experienced by subordinate groups. So those who are configured as inferior experience shame. So shame we see in the history of agrarian communities, we see it through the Industrial Revolution to build up conformity. So shame is about regulation. Now most obviously shame is used in the regulation of sexuality, but it also permeates through all levels of education, from early childhood right the way to doctoral studies, a PhD program. So think about, for example, the dunce cap. Think about the student who is marginalised, left in the corridor waiting to speak to the headmaster. Think about the naughty step, corporal punishment, right? So most of us also have seen throughout our undergraduate degree when shaming was used by lecturers, was used by academics. And I'll give an example of one of my truly great mentors. I won't mention him, but he was the great teacher of my life, a wonderful Scottish historian from Edinburgh, so that beautiful, gentle accent. And he was a great academic, and he taught me in first year right the way through to my honours degree. Remarkable man, gentle man too. Gentle, kind, caring, brilliant man. But what happened was, in a second year history tutorial, he got sick to death of this young man who came to our British history class, Victorian age, week upon week upon week upon week, and had never actually completed the reading. So week after week. And in week 5, in the tutorial, this academic asked the young man directly a question 2 minutes into the tutorial about one of the readings. So a direct question about something in the reading. And the young man couldn't answer. And then this academic said to the young man, right, have you done the reading this week? And the young man answered, no, I haven't. And this kind, very gentle, very quiet, benevolent British scholar excluded this young man from the tutorial, removed him from the class in front of us all, and told him not to come back to this tutorial until he'd done the reading. That young man never returned to the tutorial and in fact left the university. Now, what was unbelievable about that story, I think, from my perspective, as I was writing this vlog, is that story happened 32 years ago. That's older, that's longer than most of you have been alive. 32 years ago. But as you can see, it's a very hot memory with me because it was so unusual and it was shameful, right? So looking back on it now, I understand the lecturer's perspective. I really, really do. I understand that young man's perspective. I also understand the perspective of the tutorial room. Remember, rules of the group, normative. The rest of the tutorial, of which I was a member. We were working incredibly hard. We had an hour tutorial and we really wanted to learn something. And it was such, amazing material and exciting that we wanted to be flying with the material rather than having to sort of help a guy through who hadn't even bothered reading it, right? So all sorts of things were going on, but the result was the shame of a young man. Now, all of this was based on shame, and shame was mixed with disgust, anger, and I think a fair amount of frustration as well. And all of it was about normalising the behaviour of the group. And of course, that's undergraduate education, and most of us, whatever age we are, we have a story like that, because that's how a tutorial, a lab, is managed. And think about how your PhD is regulated, how your candidature, your supervisory relationships are regulated, what you read, what you write, how you spend your time, what is called an achievement, what is called success. And of course, the PhD is a normative experience. So we do push you through the sausage factory of a PhD. We do. We do. And there are plenty, tens of thousands of horror stories from doctoral education. The humiliation in a PhD oral exam, where basically an external examiner goes rogue, goes bonkers and lets rip on a student. I've seen it. It happens not a lot, but it happens enough to make it horrific. Bizarre confirmation of candidatures, where a couple of assessors drop a tab of brown acid and come in and pick a tiny little bit of the thesis and render that this huge problem. Rather than looking at the whole, they pick a couple of sentences and spend an hour and a half talking about those couple of sentences. We've all seen it. And of course, using phrases like, "You're not a very good scientist," or "That's not right," "You can't write," and of course, "You're never going to finish this thesis." Now, I can go on and on and on. I have a book where I've collected all these phrases. And shame regulates PhD supervision, and it is indeed the punctuation of PhD students, because shame is used to reinforce the inferiority of PhD students. Now, shame can be used benevolently. It can have a strength, I think, because shame can create remorse, okay? And we can, through that remorse, apologise for the damage that we've done. So I think that's an important bit of shame. But unless shame is acknowledged, unless we sort of sit in it for a moment, treat it like a comma and move on, but we do need to sit in it for a moment, then it can jump to anger, aggression, violence, withdrawal and guilt, and then those other stages become a full stop and you're stuck. So shame does emerge very unhelpfully in PhD programs, and let me show you how this happens. So why it occurs is for a large group of supervisors, advisors in the North American system, they only can supervise how they were supervised. So we call that homology, right? So how they were supervised. When I did my PhD, really? So they supervised students how they were supervised. Okay. Now the problem comes in if, and indeed when, the student is different from the supervisor. Okay? So that difference in the student is read as a deficit in the student. And of course what then happens is, deficit, the supervisor then shames the student to explain they're not living up to expectations, shame them to try and render them normalised. Okay? So this is so common, what I've just talked about there. I can feel you nodding. It's so common. This has either happened to you or it's happened to someone you know very well. Okay? So this is, of course, the deficit model of teaching and learning, the deficit model of PhD supervision. And it lives in our universities and it lives in our doctoral programs. But of course, any supervisor who assumes, in fact any scholar to be frank, but any supervisor who assumes that there's a singular way of doing a PhD, a singular methodology, can you imagine? A singular way of reading, a singular way of writing, they are deluding themselves. Also, you'll find a supervisor uses language in meetings all the time that's geared to pull you down. No, that's not right. You can't do this. Or my personal favourite, you're useless. You're useless. Okay. So shame emerges when we fail to meet the values expected by others. But it's also, for me as Dean, a sign that a deficit model of teaching and learning, a deficit model of supervision is in place. And always remember one of my favourite statistics in doctoral education, and luckily I read it very early in my tenure as Dean. And my favourite stat is the intellectual ability of the students that are TRIT, the students that leave the program, and the students that finish and go under examination. Their intellectual ability is the same. Students that leave, students that pass, their intellectual ability is the same. So in other words, people leave the program not because they're lacking intelligence. They've got the intelligence. They're leaving for another reason. And of course, then it gets worse. Who are the groups that leave? More women than men, students with an impairment, student with a disability, students of colour, older students. Okay, so shame emerges not because the students can't do the work, but because they're not doing it in a way that is validated by the supervisor. And that is why, of course, we train supervisors. We ask, nay demand, that supervisors do professional development so that they learn about a diversity of approaches in teaching and learning and supervision, so that they don't just supervise as they were supervised. And also they don't assume that how they were supervised has any relevance or value for what's happening now. Because remember what was occurring 20, 30, 40 years ago. A student in a PhD program left school, did an undergraduate degree, did honours in some systems, did a coursework masters in other systems, and then went straight into a PhD. That was the normative model. That was my model, okay? Now, supervising that student that went straight from school right the way through to a PhD program is completely different from supervising a 63-year-old nurse in Alice Springs. They are different andragogical experiences. So respecting those differences and knowing that there are thousands of ways to do a PhD, that's the key. Professional development is required. But say you are living this team right now. So there'll be people out there that maybe are getting upset, and I understand that this is your lived reality today, right now. You are living in and with shame. What can you do? Here are 5 things you can do today to treat shame as a comma and move on with your life. Let's do it. 1, most importantly, sit in shame and name it as shame. Because shame is so dreadful in our lives, we spend most of our lives trying to not actually be in it or acknowledge it, right? We avoid shame at all costs. So to avoid shame, we all do bonkers things. So, you know, we eat too much, we fall asleep, we go, I need a nap, drink too much, drugs, watch mindless television, listen to music, flick through Instagram. You do anything rather than actually sit in it and understand what's occurring. And also what happens, besides denial, is we sit in another comma state. So we move immediately to anger or guilt or fear, right? And then we just get trapped. So shame needs to be treated as a comma and then transformed, directed into action. So shame can mobilize us. So what happens is we need to translate shame into something else. We need to move from shame to compassion. But shame gains power over us when we attempt to conceal it. So don't be ashamed at shame. Know that it is being used in education to mark you as inferior. Know that and call that out. And recognize why shame is being used. And therefore, start to address the power imbalance. Remember that the shame is sort of a byproduct. That's all it is, a byproduct of unequal relationships. So when you have the experience of shame, you know something's going wrong. So start to address the power imbalance and call it that. Call it that. If you are being shamed, call it that, and then translate A into compassion, but B, address the power matter, which leads to 2. Name and understand invalidating environments. I'm talking about particularly environments that lack support. So that occurs when a student is invariably labelled as wrong. You know those situations where no matter a student say to me, no matter what I do, I seem to be doing everything wrong. Is that happening to you? Yeah. So you're supposedly the problem. You're not good enough. You. So you're in an invalidating environment. Now, these are often called in the literature a toxic lab, okay? It can also be, and I've seen this a lot, a toxic cohort or environment that encircle a supervisor. So one supervisor has created a little gang of people through homology, just like him or her, and they then use that little gang to attack anybody that doesn't belong. Now, in this environment, to summon the cliche, everything that you do is wrong. So shame in these contexts disrupts activities. So what you need to do is you can say, oh right, you are shaming me because you see me as not belonging. If you actually speak the words, then that creates some confusion in the group. It shakes it up a little bit, and that's important. But most importantly, it allows you to sit and claim your confidence. Because if you sit in an invalidating environment, if you sit in a toxic lab as that person on the outside, then you're not going to be able to think clearly, okay? Sometimes you will lose the ability to even talk. So a lot of people are so ashamed in these environments that they're just silent, yeah? And also paralysis. So you're so ashamed that you can't even act to preserve yourself. So at that point, what you need to do, okay, if this is you today, if this is you, you need to get advice outside of the system. You need to move outside of the group. So if your lab, if your research group is running on shame, that group is not going to solve your problems. You've got to go outside of it, and through mediation and some pretty tough talk, that group can be challenged and changed. So you'll need to change the rules of the game, and you can't do that on your own. Get powerful people to try and help you. So if you require a little bit more information about the proxies for shaming that exist in your learning environment, look for perfectionists, look for people pleasers, look for really aggressive behaviour, and also look for the distraction techniques that might be used in the lab in social environments. So if there's a lot of drinking happening in your lab or in your environment, it's a sign that something else is going on. Okay, 3. Recognise the value of satisfaction. Now, being satisfied has got some pretty bad press, and I know it seems a bit like a booby prize, you know, like I could be happy, I could be excited, whoa, yeah, come on. But instead, I'm satisfied. But actually, satisfaction is incredibly important in a doctoral program, because perfectionism is the enemy of a PhD. Perfectionism is the enemy of a PhD, because perfectionism gets in the way of you finishing a PhD. But satisfaction is your friend. And what else is of value in satisfaction is it is a state or a value that you can give yourself. You're not relying on a supervisor or a peer or a referee to make you satisfied. You can give that gift to yourself. So at the end of a good work day, you can nod, smile and say, I'm satisfied with that, I'm satisfied. And that allows you, of course, to manage your self-worth through focusing on what you have achieved, actions. And therefore you move your sense of self from a competitive environment with others to satisfaction in and for yourself. 4, big one. Learn to separate emotions from thoughts and thoughts from reality. When we are in extreme emotional states, like shame, like fear in particular, we just feel overwhelmed. But emotions are not thoughts. So it's very important that you feel your emotions. So an emotion, that's important, feel it. But feeling and thinking are different. So recognize how you feel about yourself can and should be different from how you think about yourself. So in a doctoral program in life, in a doctoral program, separate emotions and thoughts. Feelings are important. Don't stop them, but instead understand them. So start to translate your emotions into thoughts. But don't stop there. Also start to moderate your thoughts by asking yourself, are my thoughts real and true? Therefore, start to create some separations in your life. Don't assume that what you feel is real, and don't assume what you think is real. Do the hard yakka and separate out emotion, thinking, and reality, and then work to build the connections between them. 5. Learn to meet criticism with truth. Shame has nothing to do with truth or reality. It is an act of denial, of displacement, of fear, and of power. So when a person in power, like a supervisor or a teacher, shames you, then that act of shaming is not about truth, it is about power. So, learn to handle criticism. If you've made a mistake, cool, own it. I have made a mistake. Use the words. Mistake is not shame. Failure is not shame. A mistake is a step in learning. But if you are being abused, then call it out, and call it out accurately. create boundaries, reinforce separateness. A PhD supervisor or advisor is a PhD supervisor or advisor. They're not your friend, they're not your parent, and they sure as hell aren't your partner. Difference. Separation. Yeah. So what exists under shame is inferiority, incompetence, inadequacy. So therefore, be what Andrew Morrison described as, and I love this phrase, quote, shame sensitive. Shame sensitive. Recognize it in yourself and give yourself a break. Give yourself a break. You are a PhD student. You're learning. You're learning. You are not an experienced researcher. You make mistakes. And making mistakes, that's not a moment of shame. That's a moment of learning. So don't be passive in sitting in shame and accepting it as a full stop. Use it in your life as a comma. I wish you love, light, and peace. Tia.